Hi, this is Jonathan Slater, host of Tête à Tête Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. Tête à Tête is a production of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, l'Association d'études juives canadiennes. Empirical research is more than a numbers game. In the social sciences, for example, it allows us to ground what we know in direct observation and experience. Real world data allow us to arrive at conclusions validated by facts rather than assumptions. By challenging so called conventional wisdom and common sense, empirical research helps us to improve institutional decision making, expand social knowledge, and identify avenues of future exploration. My guest today on Tête à Tête is Professor Robert Brym. Bob has published more than 200 scholarly works and received multiple awards for his publications and teaching. He's a strong advocate for what empirical research can teach us about the condition of contemporary Canadian Jewish life. Just this past summer in 2025, the ACJS, in its journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Études juives canadiennes, published a special edition devoted to Bob's survey on antisemitism in Ontario's K through 12 schools. Bob and I will be talking more about this study later in today's episode. Also, in the summer of 2025, at the annual conference of the ACJS, Bob received the prestigious Louis Rosenberg Canadian Jewish Studies Distinguished Service Award. Let's listen to an excerpt from Bob's acceptance speech from the awards ceremony.
My favorite technique is to identify conventional wisdom and then do research showing it just ain't so. My hope is that someone will take up the gauntlet and that in doing so, we will together advance our understanding of a particular subject. Accordingly, if you take the trouble to read my recent work, you'll discover provocative generalizations supported by data systematically collected and analyzed.
Robert Brym was born in St. John, New Brunswick, the son of immigrants from Lithuania and Poland. His father was a Holocaust survivor. Bob was educated at Dalhousie University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the University of Toronto, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and S.D. Clark Professor of Sociology Emeritus, University of Toronto. He's the recipient of the University of Toronto's Northrop Frye Award, the London School of Economics British Journal of Sociology Prize, and the Outstanding Contribution Award of the Canadian Sociological Association. Bob's main research projects have focused on the politics of intellectuals, Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union and its successor states, the Second Intifada, and since 2018, Jews in Canada. Also, since 2018, he has been translating and publishing the work of Yankov Lishchinsky, the foremost social scientist writing mainly in Yiddish before World War II. Visit the show notes to today's interview to access links to Bob's published work. Bob, welcome to Tête à Tête.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. A pleasure to be here.
I want to return to what you argued in the clip we just played from your speech at the Rosenberg Award ceremony. You make a convincing case for the application of empirical analysis to social science in general, but later in your speech, you specifically make the case for the use of empirical data in understanding what's going on with Jews in Canada, particularly in terms of political behavior. Can you elaborate on that? Say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the Canadian Jewish news, for example, which contains a lot of what might be called popular opinion on the Jewish community in Canada, you find a number of assertions that seem to me to be exaggerations without substantial amounts of backup in terms of data. For example, I remember I was just thinking about the an article I read some months ago about Jews leaving Canada for Israel, becoming upset about the level of anti-Semitism in this country and therefore wanting to make Aliyah. And I looked at immigration statistics from the Israeli Bureau of Statistics and found that in recent years, the average number of Jews immigrating from Canada to Israel is something in the order of 125 to 150. That's per year. Pretty low number. And no recent uptick has been detected. On the other hand, there's been a very large uptick in the number of Israelis immigrating to Canada. Something like 7,000 temporary work permits were issued in the past year or so. So I think that very often generalizations are made in haste without the benefit of data. This is only one example. I also hear misstatements, I would say, about the politics of the Canadian Jewish community, how we vote, the level of anti Semitism in this country and its implications, and so on. So I just want to say that's one of my main motivations in wanting to do research is to try to substantiate or falsify these generalizations. Some of them may be accurate, some not so much.
Yeah, I wanted to just talk with you more about the political behavior. I was intrigued by your detailed analysis of the voting intentions of Canadian Jews in the run up to the last federal election. Let's listen to this excerpt from your Rosenberg Award speech.
Sure. Let's move this ahead to April 2025. Jewish support in that 7-month period fell 7 percentage points. That is Jewish support for the conservatives, and Jewish support for the liberals jumped 12%. Why? Well, it's because many Jews, like all Canadians, were influenced to change their minds by the resignation of Justin Trudeau, the promise of Mark Carney, and the sudden threat Donald Trump posed to Canadian well-being. By election day 2025, half the Jewish vote still supported the Conservatives, but the other half opposed them.
So, Bob, I'm going to apologize. I'm asking you to perform some mind reading and prognostication, not exactly empirical functions. So, perhaps it's not entirely fair. But can you describe what was happening in the minds of Canadian Jews in this fraught last election cycle? Well, what were the patterns revealing, and what can we expect to see in future federal races, for instance?
Well, I think in the period 2023 to 2024, particularly, Jewish support for the Conservative Party jumped to levels that we haven't seen before. 57% of Jews that I polled in Canada said that they were going to vote Conservative if an election were held the next day. That's a very large percentage. And the reason for that is, first of all, upset with Trudeau's management of just about everything in Canada. But most importantly, his willingness to behave in what the Liberals call a more even handed manner concerning the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And many Jews turned toward the Conservatives as a result of disdain for Trudeau and a certain equivocation concerning support for Israel. But that changed quite quickly once Trudeau resigned and Carney came on the scene. Then a more traditional split in the Jewish vote between liberals and conservatives was evident. In fact, if you look at the final split in the Jewish vote in 2025 in the federal election, it was almost exactly the same as the split that I recorded in our 2018 survey of Jews in Canada. There was not very much change at all. Jews were slightly more inclined than the general population to vote conservative. They were slightly more inclined to vote for the Liberal Party than the general population. And that's largely because there were a larger proportion of Canadians interested in or Quebecois in particular, eager to support the Bloc Québécois. That sort of drains away votes from both the Liberals and the Conservatives and the general population. But basically, Jews haven't changed much in their voting patterns between 2018 and 2025. There was just an exceptional period in 2023 24 when there was a big spark, a big peak, a big jump in conservative support and a deep dive for liberal support. But then we returned to what might be called normal once Trudeau was gone and Carney came on the scene. And that was also because of fears concerning Trump and the tariff war. We saw, like most Canadians did, somebody in Carney who might be able to protect us from the most extreme negative effects of Trump's tariff policy.
Bob, you talked about how in this last election, in the run up to the last election, how Canadian Jewish reaction, especially concerning the situation in Israel, may have affected people's leanings and how they voted. We're, of course, recording this podcast less than 2 days after Hamas returned the remaining living hostages held in Gaza into the arms of their loved ones back in Israel. Of course, October 7th, 2023 will be a day that lives in infamy within Israel. But it also looms large for Jews in the diaspora, and particularly in Canada, where for the last 2 years we've experienced a staggering surge in Jew hatred and anti Semitic criminality in the country. I'll ask our audience to listen to another excerpt from Bob's Rosenberg Award speech.
It turns out that by far the strongest factor influencing Canadian attitudes towards Jews is the degree to which Canadians have had positive personal experiences with Jews. The more positive their personal experiences, the more positive their attitudes towards Jews in general. And the more negative their personal experiences, the more negative their attitudes toward Jews in general.
Hearing Bob contend that social interaction and interpersonal experience seem to play a significant role in ways Canadians react to their Jewish neighbors got me thinking that maybe there's an over reliance on legislating against hate. Bob, what can we learn from this finding?
Well, I'm not sure that I would conclude that we're relying too much on legislation uh, banning hate in this country. That's not the issue. It seems to me that the issue is that we're paying far too little attention to ways of reconciling differences, to meeting people on their own ground and acting with empathy towards them. If you look at what the organized Jewish community is doing for the most part, it's attacking the enemy, it's criticizing the enemy, it's being unempathic toward the enemy. But what I found in my research on attitudes towards Jews and Muslims in Canada is that having a Jewish acquaintance and having positive relationships with Jews leads people to have positive attitudes toward all Jews. And similarly with Muslims, interacting with Muslims, being acquainted with them, befriending them, uh, allows one, encourages one to develop positive attitudes toward all Muslims. And this is true even for Jews and Muslims. That is, Jews who meet Muslims and are empathic towards them and some become and befriend them become sympathetic to all Muslims, and vice versa about Muslim interactions with Jews. So it seems to me that we're spending far too little time trying to build bridges with Muslims in Canada, trying to listen to them empathically and asking them to listen empathically to us, because there is common ground. I've found that close to a majority of all Muslims in Canada believe that the ideal solution to the Israeli Palestinian conflict is a two-state solution. And most Jews believe the same thing. And there are other areas of commonality as well. So if those areas of commonality exist, why can't we talk to one another more? It would have beneficial consequences. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't pay attention to legislation concerning hate. I think it's a very important approach to the problem. But we also have to look at the other side, developing strong empathic ties to communities that are now antagonistic towards Jews. That can have many beneficial consequences for us.
So, Bob, let's talk about antagonism toward Jews. Your latest work, a survey on anti-Semitism in Ontario's K through 12 schools, appearing in summer 2025 as a special edition of Canadian Jewish Studies, is evocative and disturbing. With this study, Bob, as journal editors David Kaufman and Joshua Tapper assert, you are once more pushing ahead the social science wing of the field of Canadian Jewish studies, as no others have since Louis Rosenberg's work of almost a century ago. For purposes of time, we won't delve into the abundant stories and statistics you convey in this study. However, I'll encourage our listeners to read the special issue. Nevertheless, in your conclusion, you do offer certain public and social policy recommendations, which you believe might help to mitigate and possibly reverse causes of anti Semitic behaviors in primary and secondary education settings. Would you share your thoughts on such measures?
Sure. Uh, I think that EDI policies have been introduced in the school system with the best of intentions. That is to recognize that there are certain disadvantaged groups in the society and that those groups deserve to be included, to be treated as equals, and deserve to be promoted and empathized with. I think those are all very noble intentions. However, in practice, EDI policies have developed into the notion that there are two classes in society, the privileged and the oppressed. And the Jews are very much an example of the privileged. And I think that this idea that there are only two classes in society creates more antagonism rather than builds bridges between groups with different levels of privilege in society. Uh, and I think that students need to be treated as equals in the classroom. And this is something that has gone by the wayside. Certain students are now treated with special care and devotion. Jews who are considered to be privileged are often treated with disdain. And that only increases the level of antagonism against Jews, as we've seen in the school system over the past couple of years. That's only one issue. I think that in addition, we lack an enforced uh, a code of conduct in schools. We allow complete freedom for students to say and do pretty well whatever they want. And therefore, there can be open harassment and is open harassment of Jewish students, which is not penalized. And I think that schools need to develop codes of conduct and need to enforce them with policies of remediation and, if necessary, punishment for harassing others. Teachers themselves need an education. Many of them provide slogans and stereotypes when they speak about the conflict in the Middle East between Jews and Palestinians, but they have very little historical background knowledge. And I think that we need to do a much better job of educating teachers in this regard. And finally, I believe we need a better reporting system. One of the things that I learned in doing this study is that uh, many, if not most, anti Semitic incidents are not reported at all. And if they are reported, half of them are defined away as being not important, not anti Semitic, and therefore don't reach the statistics reported by organizations like the Toronto District School Board. We need a much better system of tracking and reporting anti Semitic incidents, and for that matter, incidents that include Islamophobia and various other forms of racism. So those are the policy recommendations that I made in concluding the study that I did.
Orly here, Parchment's editor-in-chief. I'm thrilled to let you know that this spring you'll be able to welcome Parchment, the only literary journal devoted to contemporary Canadian Jewish writing, into your home. Parchment was founded in 1992, but since 2014, without consistent institutional support, the journal has lain dormant. Until now. I am elated to invite you to be part of this new chapter of Parchment, which will be published by the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. To read an issue of Parchment will be to hold in your hands a world as dynamic as the Canadian Jewish community itself. Our journal champions Canadian Jewish writing that is diverse in its aesthetics and national in scope. We welcome writers and readers to join us in creating a place where we can gather over writing and art that nourishes and challenges. We are seeking literary work that celebrates curiosity and ignites conversation. Don't miss the chance to be part of Parchment's return. Be the first to know when the print edition will be released and other exciting Parchment news by following us on social media at Parchment Mag, subscribing to our newsletter, and by bookmarking parchmentmag.ca. Come January, you'll even be able to order the inaugural issue. On behalf of the Parchment team, we look forward to being part of your literary life again.
Bob, I wanted to turn briefly to another of your efforts, the 2018 Survey of Jews in Canada, which was a comprehensive perspective on Jewish identity in Canada, which you developed with the collaboration of the Environics Institute for Survey Research in partnership with the University of Toronto and York University. As I understand it, you all published a report partially in response to a portrait of Jewish Americans, a 2013 Pew Research Center analysis of American Jewish life. The Canadian survey echoes the format of the earlier Pew report, focusing on larger patterns of Jewish practice and social trends in Jewish lifestyles, as well as on personal experiences of anti Semitism, relationships to Israel, and affinities with Jewish movements and organizations. Central to your report is the depiction of the contrasting ways Canadian and U.S. Jews define themselves. The Canadian study appears to provide evidence of the pronounced manner in which Jewish identity in the 21st century is developing, and in certain respects, diverging within the two countries. The Canadian survey, in particular, tends to disconfirm any notion of a uniform social, historical, and ideological experience among North American Jews. Now, it's been 7 years since that study was released. Do you have any further reflections on its significance for Canadian Jewish communities? And in your view, has anything changed, especially in light of October 7th, 2023?
Well, that's a very good question. I hear a lot of people saying that, Canada may be, the Canadian Jewish community may be different from the American Jewish community, but we're only 20 years behind them. We'll be just like them in 20 years. People generally know that the level of intermarriage, for example, is half as high in Canada as it is in the United States. The rate at which Jewish kids go to Jewish schools is much higher in Canada than it is in the US. We know about these differences, but a lot of people say we're still headed in the same direction. And I actually am not sure that that's an accurate statement. I see the Canadian Jewish community as being very resilient and cohesive. Large parts of the community are residentially segregated. There's a very high and persistently high level of attendance in Jewish schools. And I don't see that weakening much over time. So, yeah, I see a further divergence of the two communities. And we see that to some extent in the reaction of the two communities to the terrible events over the past couple of years in Israel and in Gaza, because the split in the American Jewish community is much wider. There is a much larger proportion of American Jews that have spoken out in the harshest terms possible against Israel. And we see less of that. We see some of that in Canada, but less of that. And that to me is also an example of how the Jewish community in this country has moved less or not as far down the road of assimilation as the American Jewish community has. So I see that as a big difference. And by the way, uh, one of the other things that we noticed or that we found in the studies in this book is that, in fact, the difference is not between just Canada and the United States. It's between the United States and all other major diaspora countries. For all other major countries, diaspora countries, Israel is a central part of Jewish identity, not so much for the United States. Israel is much less important for American Jews. And the evidence for that became very clear in the reaction to the Israel Hamas war. So I do see those trends developing, continuing to develop, a further divergence between Canadian and American Jewish communities.
Well, let's talk more about Canadian Jewish communities. 2 years ago, you and Professor Randall Schnur of York University compiled The Ever Dying People, Canada's Jews in Comparative Perspective, in which you wrote, demise by assimilation or anti Semitism is often held to be the inevitable future of Jews in Canada. The compendium's notable authors reflect on a wide range of comparative data about Jewish life from within Canada and elsewhere in the world. Looking back at this book, Bob, what do you consider the vital takeaway from its collection of scholars? Is it, in fact, demise?
No, I don't think it is demise. I think that we can see a strengthening of the Jewish community in this country over the past few years as a result of the Israel Hamas war. The Canadian Jewish community has become more solidary, more unified than it was. It doesn't mean there are no divisions within it. In fact, there is very widespread antipathy in the Jewish community toward the Israeli government, but not toward Israel itself. And that's important. Canadian Jews remain, for the most part, 94% of them supportive of the idea of the existence of a Jewish state in Israel. Most of us are Zionists, if not in name, then in practice. Uh, so I believe, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. So, sorry, what was your question again? Remind
Well,
me.
the question is, looking back at this book,
Hmm.
what do you consider the vital takeaway from its collection of scholars? Is it in fact demise?
Yeah. So I would say that the community is not in a state of demise. I would say that it is has been strengthened. We see in the community an increase in the proportion of parents who want to send their kids to Jewish schools. We know that Jewish schools are having to build new classrooms and new buildings to accommodate the influx of Jewish students. Partly because of the way they're being treated in the public school system. Synagogue attendance is up, synagogue membership is up. We see overall increased cohesiveness in the Jewish community. So I see signs of increasing resilience in the community, increasing solidarity over time. And that's partly because of increased anti Semitism. I quote Jean Paul Sartre, who wrote that the anti Semite creates the Jew. Uh, there is a considerable amount of truth in that. And we see that principle operating now. Um, that doesn't mean there are no positive forces pushing making the Jews a cohesive group, but there are also negative forces doing that. So no, it's not, and it's not the end of the story. Anti-Semitism is having positive effects on the solidarity of the Jewish community.
Bob, there's been one question on my mind, which I'd like to cover before we close out the interview. Do you have any thoughts or advice, for example, for the young people who might be listening to this podcast, who might not be familiar with your work, with your writing and your research? What would you say to these Canadian Jewish young people right now as they're embarking on their professional careers, for example? What would you say that could help them navigate this new and changing landscape here in Canada?
I'd say the most important thing that one can learn from my work is that the Jewish community of Canada is not a monolith. It's heterogeneous, and that people can make it what they want. They can change it, in other words. Right now, we see, for example, politically, that the community is pretty evenly split between liberals and conservatives. Sometimes you get the impression from reading the Jewish press that it's almost solidly conservative. That's just not true. The community is split in its support for the policies of the current Israeli government. There's a lot of opposition in the Jewish community, particularly among young people, to many of the policies concerning the judicial system, the treatment of Palestinians, and so on. While there's still very strong support for Israel itself as a Jewish state. On the other hand, there are people who oppose the views of the young on these issues. And I think that that heterogeneity is a good thing. I think it means that young Jews now getting involved in a serious way with Jewish life can contribute a lot to how the Jewish community is going to look in 20, 30 years from now. And I find that very encouraging. My money is on the side of youth. I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you again, Bob. I really appreciated your time with me today on the podcast. I'm Jonathan Slater, and you've been listening to Tete a Tete. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to our special guest, Robert Brym. This show was produced and edited by Theodora Draper in Toronto. Our music is provided by J.K. Bradley. Our executive producers are Joshua Tapper and David Kaufman. Tête-à-Tête is a podcast of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. You can find out more about the ACJS by checking out our website, acjs-aejc.ca, with plans to be new and improved by early 2026. Stay tuned for additional information. In the show notes, you can find a transcript of my conversation with Robert Brym and a link to the Canadian Jewish Studies Special Edition, a survey on antisemitism in Ontario's K-12 schools. You will also find links to the works mentioned in today's episode, as well as other publications by Robert Brym. We're grateful to our supporters, the Taubin family, the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council's Aid to Scholarly Journals program, and the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry at York University. If you have comments or thoughts about this podcast episode or any other of our episodes, feel free to email us at acjs@yorku.ca. Come back and join us for another conversation.